Hi and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a lovely day today, no matter what it is you're doing. For the free wire tutorial here today on YouTube, I'd like to share a design which can be very easily scaled down for teeny tiny cabochons. Now, I'm well known for making rather elaborate and large jewellery pieces, especially pendants. Now, these are not for everyone, so what I'd like to do is show you how you can take a very small cab, or in this instance a teeny tiny bead, and prong set that in a very simple design. Now, if you've never tried prong setting, this could be the perfect introduction for you. I've tried to make it as easy as possible, and a very simple piece using just 2 gauges of wire and 1 length of each gauge. So let's head down closer to the board. You'll need to get closer to see them because they are indeed quite teeny tiny and diminutive. So I have a couple of examples of the technique we're going to apply today. You can either go for an incredibly simple bail or you can use my low-key wrapped bail, and that's what I'm going to show you today. So this bead is around about 10 or 11 millimeters across. It's quite a small one. It does have a drill hole, but that drill hole hasn't been used at all. So I've treated it like a small cabochon. It can be sized down much further than this, safe anywhere really from 8 millimeters to 20 millimeters. It's so tiny I can't even hold it. I've also made one with this lovely faceted aquamarine with that simplified bail. So I'm just going to pop those up into the top corner for now. I've got a couple of examples of the type of cabochon you can use for this particular technique. I've got a beautiful rainbow moonstone. I might close the curtain actually, it's quite bright, it's slightly bleaching the colour out. It's lovely to have sunshine. That's got a beautiful rainbow in it. So something like that, which is around about 16 millimeters by 13 millimeters, is ideal. This is quite a deep cabochon, but it will still work even though it's a smaller size. The piece I'm going to work with today is ever so slightly larger. This is around about 18 millimeters. It's a faceted black spinel. Now, this is a drilled bead, but I'm going to use it exactly as if it was a cabochon, and it will work in the same technique way as well. So even though this is dual faceted and does indeed have a little bit of a girdle going on, we're going to treat it exactly the same as if it were a cabochon. Now, in terms of the wire that we're going to work with, I'm going to be using soft raw copper wire, and I have a length here of around about 12 inches, and that is 1 millimeter or 18 gauge. Now, I do love to work with the soft raw copper. One of the reasons is that it will start to darken in the next couple of days, or you can treat it with something like a liver of sulphur to give that a beautiful antiqued copper look. Now, as ever, we're going to want to smooth and warm that wire through. So let's just give that a lovely rub between thumb and forefinger a couple of times to get that nice and fluid. Now, I'm not going to worry just at this stage about the ends, because in all likelihood I'm going to trim just a little bit off the end anyway. Now, for the main part of the tutorial today, it's very similar to my standard prong setting designs, apart from the fact that I'm going to be using slightly smaller flat facing pliers. I'm going to be using my Beadalon tapered chain nose pliers. I'm going to start in the middle of that length of wire that we're working with. So in the same way as my regular prong setting design works, I'm going to start with a right angle, and then I'm going to use my pliers to create a series of upright prongs in that baseline of wire. Now, I'm going to use a particular point on my pliers. You can see I made a line further down these pliers for a different technique, but I'm going to use a slightly higher area today. But what I want to do is make sure that all of my prongs are the same length. So at the moment, much like my standard prong setting design, we have this kind of a zigzaggy Z bend. And what we're going to do is to support the upright section just like so, and draw the wire back down. And then we're going to give that a really hearty squish. Now, in order to do this safely without making the wire sit over at a funny angle, we're going to do this in a number of small movements. So I'm applying a very small amount of pressure, a little bit at a time like so, just to close up that prong. Now, you can leave them with a tiny little bit of a gap, as I have done with the rainbow moonstone. You can see there's a tiny bit of a gap just at the ends of those prongs, which looks really pretty, or you can completely close them up as I did with that faceted aquamarine design. I'm going to close them up completely today, and that just takes a little bit of control and very small repeated movements. And you can see that we've got a nice straight line on that hairpin bend. And the next thing we want to do is to bring the wire back along the baseline. If I pop it down like so, and you imagine this is a heart trace, what we want is a straight line across the bottom with a series of prongs coming up. Now the best way that I can get this to happen is to hold my pliers carefully against that prong and push the remaining section of wire up. And what we're looking for is nice sharp angles. It will twist around in your hands, and we want to do that by just refining each of those small movements, getting that to be a nice flat line. So if you have a straight edged ruler, you can use that just to clarify that that line does indeed not deviate from the straight. And we're then going to use the same point on the pliers to generate the gap between the prongs. Now if you're working with a very, very tiny piece, if you're working say with something that's even smaller than this 10mm, so you're taking it down to 6 or 8mm perhaps, you will need to think about how long you want the prongs to be. For the piece in my hand, it's a reasonably deep bead that I've used. So I've kept the prongs at this kind of length, and they are around about 4 to 5mm in length. You can pop a mark on your pliers so that you get the same repeated size every time. If you're working with a piece that's a little bit larger, this is around about 16mm from base to top, then you can make a slightly larger prong. Or if you have a very deep cabochon, like this diminutive moonstone, it's a tiny sized cabochon, but it's quite deep. Now because of that depth, you will want to have reasonably long prongs again. If you see any yellow on my hands, I was refilling a pot of turmeric yesterday, and I'm very, very turmeric-y. If you've ever worked with turmeric powder, it stains your hands for days. So of course, because I had a video coming up today, that's what I chose to do. So I'm going to hold that wire again, and I'll just tilt that up at the same position I used earlier, which is just a little bit further than the black mark. And I'm just going to push the wire up firmly so that I get the beginnings of my next prong. And then I'm going to pop those pliers back in at around about that same position again, push the wire over, and then repeat that prong making process. So I'm going to support the top of the prong, I'm going to push the wire down, and then very, very carefully, in small movements, I'm going to bring that back in. Now at this stage, before I've made any hard and final changes to the shape and form of the wire, I'm just going to check that those prongs are going to be the same kind of length. At this stage, if you've made that prong a little bit long, you can open that out slightly and move the prong tip down a little bit. So you have options just to make sure that they are the same length. So I'm going to repeat that for a second time, and very, very carefully just close that up. We want to keep it as flat as possible, so I'll take a couple of moments just to squish that down so that it's kept in 2 dimensions, and then I'm going to flatten that across like so, and you'll see that we've got our second prong made. Now if you struggle with holding the prong whilst you bring the tail of the wire up, there is a second way that you can do this. So you can take the tail of wire instead, and bring that down slightly to the board, and you can turn that tail of wire over to create that straight baseline. So you've got 2 different technique variations there to make those prongs. What I'm going to do now is create a line of these, making sure that I retain that flat line across the base, and I think I'll probably need about 6 or 7 prongs. In the aquamarine piece, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And in the teeny tiny little moonstone, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, ideally, I like to have an odd number of prongs because it means I can put a prong at the base and centralise it. It gives a sense of symmetry to the design. However, if you position your even number of prongs correctly, you shouldn't struggle too much to get that sense of symmetry anyway. So it's really imagining how many you will need to go around. And what I tend to do is I'll create a stack of prongs, probably 1 or 2 less than I think I'll need, and then I'll just estimate the size of the outside edge of the bead or the cabochon that I'm using, and just make sure that I've got enough prongs, but it doesn't need to go too tight at the top. You're almost better to have a slightly larger gap at the top than have them too close together because it looks a little bit clustered. So I'm going to continue along this line and make a series of prongs in exactly the same way, and I'll join you back in a second. So I've created a series of prongs at the centre of my length of wire. So say I started here and I made a couple of prongs and I saw that I had much more wire remaining on the other side. All you do is flip it around. Just try and keep your set of prongs, trying to find the right bit of light, in the centre of the wire, so you've got reasonably equal amounts of wire left on either side. It'll give you more choices when you get to create the bail at the top of the design. So if we head back down to the board, I'll show you just how to make sure that that's nice and flat and square and true to all of your angles. So I've got my series of prongs centralised on that wire, or as near as it matters, and if you find that some of the sections down at the bottom aren't quite straight, you can just kind of run along there and give that a bit of a straighten up. Make sure all of those prongs are sitting at 90 degrees and try and ensure as you're going through as much as you can that you've got that nice flat baseline going along. So I'm reasonably happy with how that sits. You can pop it down onto the paper if you need to, and if you just push it down, if I tilt that slightly, you'll be able to see if there's too much deviation in that straight line. It looks pretty neat to me. You can, of course, take a lot more time than I am today just to refine and make sure all of your prongs are the same length. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have a very, very deep coin or cabochon to work with, you'll want slightly longer prongs. If you're working with a teeny tiny bead, which is slim as well as diminutive, you'll need slightly smaller beads, and you can achieve that by popping a mark on your pliers so that you get that repeated design. Now for me, the perfect aesthetic is to have the distance of a prong the same distance as between the prongs. So your prong is one prong high, but it's also one prong apart from the next one over. You might notice that there's a little bit of variation in the distance here. If that happened to you, you can ever so gently just push your pliers a little bit further up and then pull those two prongs closer together, and you should ever so slightly even up those sizes. As long as you're not crushing the wire too hard, you should be able to get it to do what you want it to, especially if you choose a nice soft raw copper wire like I have. So overall, I'm quite happy with how that's looking so far. For the next part, what we're going to achieve is the bend of the prong itself. Now if I pop this down onto the board for a second and I push the flat baseline of that section of pronging down to the board, and I just allow my bead or my cabochon to sit next to it, I can see that my bead or cabochon comes about halfway up those prongs. So that's a reasonably good size for this piece. I'll just push that up and out of the way. For the next bit, I'm going to use 2 pairs of pliers. Now if you have any very deep, flat, wide pliers like these really quite hideous old ones that I've had since forever, they are ideal because what we're going to do is pinch the base of the prong first, and ideally I want to support just about 40% of the length of the prong from the base, and I'm going to centralise that prong inside the jaws of the pliers and hold that very, very firmly with my non-dominant hand. Now you can use your bent chain nose pliers or your chain nose pliers for this, whatever works best. And what we're going to do is start bending the tips of the prongs over. So having that broader section of plier over the base of the prong itself means that the wire doesn't gap apart. If you use very narrow pliers to support the base of the prong, what can happen is one section here comes apart slightly from the next section of that baseline. So if you do have any, even if they're quite inexpensive, old, very, very broad tip pliers, they are super handy to have. I don't know where I got these from. It was probably a tool sale about 12 years ago. So I'm going to repeat that all the way along my section of pronging, centralising the base of the prong inside the jaws of the pliers and holding it at around 40% of the distance from the baseline to the tip. Just under halfway if you're not great at maths. I am really not great at maths. So I'm going to centralise that prong inside the jaws of the pliers and just take the tip over. In a moment I'm going to tip the design up on its side so you can see how I'm creating the shape of the prongs. Let's just put those down for a second, and if I turn this up towards you, you'll be able to see I'm trying to keep them reasonably even, but I'm not making a very hard, flat, 90-degree bend. It's curving. And part of that is having a really good, strong grip with my non-dominant hand, holding the prong section good and steady. And then I'm gripping the very tip of that prong and pulling the whole thing over. So I'm using the band of metal that forms the end of the jaw of the pliers to support the prong as I'm bending it and turning it into a nice, curvy, over-the-top shape. So let's just get those last couple of pieces done. Don't feel that you have to rush any of this at all. If things go slightly awry and you've got one prong which bends at a slightly different place, do take a moment just to go back and address that before you move on to the next stage. And you'll notice that I'm taking probably more time positioning the pliers than I am actually making the bend, because it really does make a difference, especially when you're working on a teeny tiny piece. Something you may also notice is that the wire starts to bend around, so we've already got a little bit of curvature going on. Now when you're working with gargantuan great big beads or cabs, that's really helpful because it starts to do part of the curving work for you. With your teeny tiny pieces, and you can use this is actually a fancy shaped aquamarine. It's not a perfect pear, it's slightly asymmetrical, much like myself. So you can use this design for rounds, you can use it for marquise shapes, pear drops, fancy shapes, all kinds of beads and cabs. So to form that baseline, the bottom section that is furthest away from the curved prongs, you can either use some slightly fine tipped bent chain nose pliers or your standard tapered chain nose pliers. I'm going to use these ones. I've had them forever and they feel really good and secure in my hands. So the first thing I'm going to do is start by warming the ends of the wire that have none of that prong work set into it. And I'm just going to open that out slightly, like so, just stroking the wire to get it to open up. I'll do exactly the same on the far end, and this is just to aid me in setting the shape in that baseline of wire around the prong proficiently. So let's just open that wire out slightly. You can see all I've done is just put it coming away from the inside of those prongs. Now I'm going to start very, very gently down at that baseline, and I'm just going to make very, very small manoeuvres to start curving the wire around. Now it does pay to take your time with this, because if you are working with a very tiny, tiny piece, this one, as I say, is about probably 10 millimeters, just under ½ an inch anyway. Yes, that's a bead. No, I haven't used the drill hole. You will notice any harsh bends that you make in the wire, even though it's a teeny tiny design. So if you can take your time and be very, very patient with yourself and just allow the wire to make very, very small movements. If you think that you've got a straight line and you just put 4 bends in the wire, you'll see it's very angular. If you make multiple tiny movements, you'll have to go along that baseline more than once. You can see that we've just started to make that shape begin to happen. Doing it twice or 3 times to make those small movements less able to be seen by the naked eye, it will give you a much finer finished project. So there we go. We're just going to take some very, very tiny movements, and it is a slow process, and it should be a slow process. So you may notice that there's a slight gap at the base of this prong. I'm just going to tighten that up and very, very gently support the prong whilst I bring that baseline around. I'm not afraid to put my hand right inside the design and just support it. Now that's curving ever so slightly at one end on the base, so I'm just going to carefully bring that up slightly, and then in a moment we're going to be able to start offering the design up to our bead or our cabochon. So that's starting to look reasonably close together, and I did just guess that I would need 7 prongs. If you needed another one, you do still have the capacity on whichever end is longest to add another one in. Taking them out is much more tricky. In fact, I would say impossible. So try to make fewer than you need if you can't exactly measure it. Of course, you could do some really good mathematics and you'd be able to then work out how long the pronged section would need to be. But it's always better to have too few than too many. So I'm just going to allow the gemstone itself to help me with that last little bit of forming. And we want to bring those 2 tail wires quite close together. Now we don't want this gemstone to be absolutely rammed hard inside the little prong basket that we're making. We want to have a teeny tiny amount of airspace because we will be wanting to wire wrap around one of those baseline wires in the middle of the design down at the bottom. So I'm going to be very subtle with any editing that I need to do. I think I need to just bring that slightly more tightly round. And then what we will do, once we're happy with the form that fits around the majority of the gem, and as I said, you can use this on fancy shaped gemstones, what I'm going to do next is start by bending those tail wires away at hopefully what will become the 12 o'clock position on your pendant. Ideally, that needs to be equal distances on either side from the base of that last prong. I'm just going to hold that for a second, and you will at this stage be able to see if there are any gappy baggy bits, slightly uneven there. So if I'm making this to sell, I will take a few moments just to make sure that I'm completely happy with how that sits. And if that means opening it out again and then closing it up more delicately, then so be it. Because I'm being very gentle with the wire, and because I have made sure to warm it thoroughly before we've started the project, you should be able to make any minor edit to that wire shape as you need. So if I remove now the gemstone from the product, from the design, I'm just going to hold that and assess what I need to do next. So for me, I like to have quite good strong angles at the shoulder. So in order to do that, I'm just going to adjust how I'm holding it and push that wire firmly against my pliers and then carefully pull that up to the straight line. You'll see that we've got a nice strong angle on this side, and I'll need to now do the same thing on the other side. I like a little bit of symmetry in these pieces, but you can be as fluid with your designs as you like. So we've got those two quite strong angles now, and we'll readjust them in just a moment to get them to sit upright. Let's again pop that gemstone in and take a look at how it's sitting. That all looks pretty neat and tidy to me. You could refine any shapes where you see baggy bits or bits that are too tight. Again, just saying that you will need to see just a tiny bit of light between the frame and the gemstone, so you can attach in that finer gauge wire in just a moment. So if I drop that back out for now, I'm going to take these two upright sections and get them to be nice and straight. Now don't rush this part. It's very tempting to kind of run on through a design as quickly as possible. What we're looking to do is to get some strength into those angles now, because we'll be corseting those two upright wires together to help us create the bail in a little while. You can, if you want to, just open those ends out to make life easier later on. But where we're at now, I'm quite happy with how that's looking. I do just want to adjust these and make sure that that baseline is indeed still flat. So if you put that down to the board, you'll see if there's any air underneath the wire. You do want it to be as flat as possible. And you can just gently give that a bit of a squish and a squeeze if you need to. For the last part of today's tutorial, I'm going to show you the easiest way that you can secure a cabochon at the back of a design. It's a basic corset design with a finer gauge of wire. I'm going to be using 0.4mm or 26 gauge in that same raw copper. I love how it works. It's really smooth and fluid, and you can still get great tension with this wire. And it's just going to corset the back of the design together, and I'll use the continuation of the same piece of wire to create a simplified bail. Now, before you start corseting that gemstone into the basket you've made, it does pay to make sure that all of your prongs are sitting at the same height. So you can pop that gemstone in and see if anything is at a funny angle. You can mildly change the angles of those prongs a bit later, but what it's really difficult to do is to push one down. Now, can you see that this one is ever so slightly more raised than the ones opposite? So what you can do is to support underneath that frame wire and just gently coerce those prongs to sit down where you need them to sit for your particular gemstone. You can also just adjust the angles of those if you need them to be adjusted. Pop the gemstone back in and see if anything is raised. That one's still a bit high, so I'm just going to draw that down slightly and make sure that I'm happy. That's a little bit better, that sits more neatly. So with the angles of the prongs, you will be able to just move that very gently after you've sewn that gemstone into position, or you've corseted the back in. But the height of the prongs is a little bit more difficult to do anything with. So let's talk wire. I have an 18-inch length of that 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire. And I'm going to lay one end over the... it's attacked me, sorry. Over the bottom of that section opposite where your bail is going to be. So rather than starting in the immediate section next to that lowest central prong, I'm going to start in the next adjacent one up. So if this is the 6 o'clock position, let me just orient it like a clock face. Instead of starting in this gap, I'm going to start just here in the next available gap. That's because if you start right down at the bottom, the first pass of wire will lift and come outside of the frame. So we're going to start a little bit further over, and then we'll get a nice straight line from here to here, which will act in a nice supportive and secure fashion. So I'm going to lay around about an inch of that wire over the rear side of our little cabochon frame. You might like to size that down slightly if you have a really teeny tiny frame, and I'm going to start by winding that around in the gap. So it needs to be the next adjacent gap, not the lowest one. So I'm going to use my pliers to just help me get this into those nooks and crannies, and of course you can do the same. You will need at least 4 or 5 rotations of wire around that framework just to make sure that it is good and secure. So you can do this by hand, or you can use your pliers, whatever makes you happy. Whatever is easiest on your eyes and your fingers. Now you can see that I've got that rotation of wire is going around the frame, but it's not very tight at the moment. So I will just make sure that that's good and secure before I continue. I think probably I will just use all of the wire I laid over the top rather than having a set amount of rotations around the wire. You will need at least 4 or 5 rotations to get a really good secure grip. There is a little bit of tension to be put into this wire. Another thing to note is where the very last cut end of that wire sits. I want it to sit inside the framework. If it sits on the very back of the design, it can scratch your body or your hair or your clothes or whatever. So you get that end bit to sit right inside the design. If it sits at the front, it's visible, and I don't want that. So you will need to just make sure. What I'm going to do is just gently rotate that around until I'm certain that that cut end is snuggled and hidden away neatly. That looks pretty good. So I can lift the wire up and insert my gemstone into position and just push that down into that little basket that we've created, making sure that it sits evenly and that those prongs are all the same length and that the angle change on the prongs is at the same depth. So I'm going to just very gently one time smooth that little bit of wire that's coming away from that connection point. Give that a little bit of a snuggle to make sure it's nice and neat and tidy. Now rather than bringing the first pass of wire down to the centre point, I'm just going to go slightly further. If I attach the wire here, as I pull it tight, it stands the risk of just coming outside of the margins. So what I'm going to do is very tentatively see if that's going to work well enough. So I'm going to find the end of this long tail of wire. I'm allowing the connection point over the surface of the rear side of that piece that we're working on together, and I'm going to take the tail end and push that up inside between the gemstone and the frame that we've created. So let's just get this all connected. Pulling that through, what will often happen is you'll end up with a kink or a loop in this section of the wire around here. So just control that where you want it to go by supporting and guiding it with one of your non-dominant fingers. Very, very slowly forwards. And we're going to have a look and see how that looks. I think that's actually going to work quite nicely. What can happen is it will plop outside the frame. One thing you can do to help that not to plop outside the frame, you don't want it visible from the front, is to bring the tail of the wire, it's come up between the frame and the gemstone. We're going to take the cut end and we're going to push that underneath the pass of wire across the back of the gemstone that we've already set, and I'm just going to pull that all the way through. I'm going to knock the camera as well because it's me and it wouldn't be the same if I didn't. I'm going to just put a little bit of tension in that first section of wire, making sure that I don't get any kinks or knots in this fine wire as we move through. And I'm going to pull that forwards. And in doing so, what we're doing is bringing this pass of wire, our first important structural piece, away from that frame. So when we turn this over and we look at it from the front, you're not seeing anything other than really than the connection point. So we've now got the wire coming back towards our connection point, and we're going to move up to the next available position. So let's find that cut end, and I'm going to push that up again in between the frame and that gemstone. You can see me wiggling that around, so you can see exactly where that's going to come up and through. Now at this point it may slip around the prong, so do protect and control. If you can see any yellow staining on my fingers, that's the turmeric I was dealing with yesterday. So I'm going to pull that nice and firmly, but not so firmly that I disrupt the wire's course. And I'm just going to very gently pinch that by hand. What I'm going to do again now is to bring the cut tail of the wire up underneath from the bottom of the design, behind that last pass of wire we just made. And I'm going to pull that all the way through, just controlling it with the same fingers over here on this hand to make sure that it doesn't get knotted. I'm just going to rotate this around so I can fully control it, making sure that this doesn't get too tight, knotted or looped. And I'm going to very gently pull that over into position. And can you see how the wire wraps around itself before we travel again all the way across the back of that gemstone, pick up the cut end of the wire and insert it in the next available space between those prongs. So between the prong setting and the gemstone again, drawing the wire up and through, and just supporting and making sure that you don't get any kinks. What I often do is use my thumb or a finger as a guide to make sure that I can control how the wire then moves into position. A little bit of a gentle pull will get that sitting neatly. And then again, we're going to take the cut end of the wire and pass that up behind the pass of wire we've just created on the back of the gemstone. Gently flip that around, and this is the sort of thing that happens. Your wire will turn around on itself. So if you can get your hand inside there or parts of your fingers inside there, you will just support the wire, pulling that gently through until such time as it sits exactly where you want it to. Now that hasn't actually caught, so I'm going to do that again. Over the outside and then underneath that last pass of wire. I'm not quite sure what happened there, so we'll just pull that through again, and hopefully this time we've caught it. We have indeed, and there we are. So I'm just going to pull that tight, and we've got that connected on the rear side. So we're going to go into the last section on this side, which is just to loop around this section before the shoulder. So this is an easy one. You can simply loop that around, bring the wire down and over to create that looping effect, and then pop the wire underneath the last pass of wire you just created, like so. So the wire's travelling underneath the last cross section of wire. Gosh, turmeric doesn't half stay in your hands. Support that wire as it comes through. Now you can see the wire is getting a little bit tense and looped, so I'm just going to support that as it pulls through. To our last connection point on this side. So again, we're taking the cut tail of wire, pushing it between the gemstone and the frame, and then we're, oops, it's decided to pop back out. That does happen quite frequently, if I'm honest. So let's just support that section of looped wire as we bring that last stitch all the way through. And you can see that's a little bit loose, so I'll just tighten that up slightly before I draw the wire back down towards the base of the pendant, and then push that underneath the last little bit of wire we've just looped up together. Naturally enough, it's tinking on the camera. Pull that through into position, and you can see that we've safely and securely put a little bit of corset netting over the back of that gemstone. If you flip this over and do a shake test, that gem is going nowhere. So what we're going to do with this elongated section of tail wire is, first and foremost, make sure that our uprights are indeed upright and parallel. So I'm going to do a little bit of weaving. On this teeny tiny moonstone bead piece, I did a 5 and 5 basket weave. So that's exactly what I'm going to do here. I'll start on this side. Let's get those pliers out the way, and I'm just going to rotate 5 times around the first side. So that's 1, that's 2, that's 3, that's 4, and that's 5 times. And once I've done those 5 rotations, I'm going to tighten them up carefully with the tips of my pliers. The wire has come around this side, up the centre. So I'm then going to wrap it 5 times around what is on your screen now as the lower of the 2 neck wires. And I'm going to make sure that there's a good deal of tension in that. I want those 2 to be parallel, and I want them to neatly and carefully house my gemstone. I don't want that gemstone escaping anyway, especially if it's a teeny tiny precious one like this aquamarine. So I will simply continue for about 1 inch to 1.5 inches or so with this 5 and 5 basket weave, tightening up every time I do those 5 rotations. You could go for a 3 and 3, whatever makes you happy. So I've done a little bit of weaving along those upright bale wires. I've gone for a 5 and 5 weave, and I've gone for around about 1.5 inches from the point that we leave the pendant section with the gemstone to the point that I've stopped weaving, and we've still got a tail of a couple of inches on the end there to work with. So I'm going to show you now how to do my super easy, simple Loki bale, and then we will look at the whole piece all together. So overall I'm quite happy with how this is sitting, but if you do need to change the direction of any of those prongs, then you can do that at this stage. I'm going to use the curved sides of my bent chain nose pliers just to very, very gently move that prong over just a little bit, and I'm looking for a relatively even spacing between those prong tips. Now you could make those prongs a little bit shorter for a diminutive piece like this. Just play around with the design and see how you go. So it's nice and safely secured from the back side, and it passes the shake test. So what we're going to do is borrow a flat pair of pliers, and we're going to put a forwards bend just a little distance away from the main gemstone section, and it doesn't need to be a full 90 degrees, 45 degrees is adequate. And then we're going to find a round form. I'm going to use my stepped bale makers. What I want to do is to use this next section of the wire that we've woven to create one full circuit of a round form. So you can bear that in mind when you think about how far you want to go with that weaving. I'm just going to turn that around until I get all of that weaving back to the point at which we made that little angle. Now, if your bale makers aren't large enough and you've done more weaving than you need, you could grab yourself a marker pen. I'm just going to open that out slightly, pop the marker pen into position, try to keep that as straight as possible, and you can see how we're looking to get back to that angle where the wire is completely naked. So we're looking at this from the rear side now. I'm just going to gently splay open those naked bits of wire, and I'm going to draw the left hand one to the left, the right hand one to the right. If you've got a tiny bit of unwoven just at the back here, don't worry about that at all. You might find a slightly narrower pen to use, absolutely up to you, but I'm not going to let it worry me. We just pop that round form back into position and draw both of those tails neatly alongside that woven bale so that they sit upright, like so. What we will then do is trim them to equal lengths with a nice flush cut using those semi-flush cutters. Well, I don't know where they went. There's one of them. There's the other one, found it. And what we will then do is make some nice coils to sit on those very, very end bits. So basic round nose pliers. You can, if you wish to, just pop that back onto your round support frame. Start creating those round coils, the rounded forms, like so. I tend to start one on one side, one on the other side, trying to get the central section of those round forms to be the same kind of dimension. And then I'm going to switch to my flat facing pliers, in this case my bent chain nose pliers, and very carefully bring that coil to sit at the centre front of the bale design. And this is my Loki bale, which I absolutely love and I use quite a lot. So let's just draw that back down. You may need to elevate that coil away at an angle to make your life easier. And then once it sits at the correct height, you can then splash that down flat remove your round form and you've got a really easy low-key bail. If somebody pulls that off the neckline, it won't end well for anybody, but if somebody tries to take my necklace off me, I'll probably slap them a little bit. So there you go. You've got your finished piece. And you can, as I say, just play around with any of those directions if you need to, always being respectful of that gemstone. I'll just open that out slightly. That makes me a little bit happier. Make sure that everything is good and secure. And you are set to go. This can obviously be made much, much smaller. So I have done this with gemstones as small as 6mm before, which is something that people often ask me about. How do I set tiny gemstones? Because I often see large cabs being used. I've demonstrated with a piece that's probably around about 18mm, just because it's easier for you to see, but the concept is exactly the same no matter what size or shape of gem, cab or bead you intend to use. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed the prong setting techniques for small cabochons today. I know that I enjoy this process, and it is something that you can challenge yourself to take down really to quite small measurements. Have yourself a beautiful day, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon on the Gem Hawks YouTube channel. Bye for now.